So welcome everyone to tonight's session, and we will start with the news. We'll start with the news. The first thing people that are observant noticed is there was a typo in the first line. It says, there is an annual Ring of Fire solar eclipse coming this week. No, not annual, annular, as in ring, as in annulus, coming this week. It'll be shortly before dawn on Thursday, June 10th, but it will not be visible for us here in South Florida. So you have to look to, virtual telescope or somebody doing online observing to see it. But it's not a total eclipse. It's not a partial eclipse. It's an annular eclipse, as in the sun should cover, the Earth's, the moon should cover the disk of the sun except for the outside edge of it. So later this decade, 2028 to 2030, NASA will be sending two probes to Venus, the Veritas probe and the Da Vinci Plus probe. One of them is destined to drop slowly through the atmosphere, sampling for all of those potential signs of biologic life in the atmosphere, and the other, I think, is an orbiter. So the Mars InSight lander, it's a lander, it's not a rover, has been on Mars for a while, and collectively the dust storms had covered its solar panels to the point where they were concerned about the reduction in power. So they kind of took a hint from Curiosity, and they grabbed up a scoop of dirt and basically used it to dust off the solar panel. One kind of dirt got rid of one kind of silt. So the power levels came back up, and now InSight's all happy again. So we have yet another probe on Mars. This one's not a rover, it's just a lander, but it's been there for a while. So Tuesday of this week, the US Space Force from Cape Canaveral Space Station in Titusville, Florida, launched, Cocoa Beach, I believe, not Titusville, that's the city below it, launched a missile launch detection satellite on behalf of the US government. And if you remember, I was saying a week ago about the United Launch Alliance, their Vulcan rocket wasn't ready, so they were having to use their Atlas V rocket. Hey, to launch this missile launch detection satellite, ULA used an Atlas V rocket. So they're making money off that translated contract that they arranged. A Tesla Dragon cargo capsule carrying new solar panels, baby squids, and 500 tardigrades was launched and has docked with the International Space Station. Not to be left out, China launched and docked a robotic cargo spacecraft with their new space station. Sad news, the James Webb Space Telescope is probably going to be launch delayed again. They're having issues with the Ariane 5 rocket, which would be used to launch it. And it'll be delayed again. And they're saying that if it gets delayed much past the end of this year, they may have to rethink how they launch it. So, by the time they actually get it launched, all the technology is going to be obsolete. The concept of it being an infrared telescope and the sun panel, glare blocker, all that stuff will probably be technologically abstracted, where it'll probably still work fine. But their infrared camera will be, 10 years out of date. So any other news items that people heard of recently this week?
Yeah, we were talking last week about the UFOs. It's all over the news now.
Yeah, I haven't seen the official report yet. Everybody's leaking like hints from it. And the military says, yes, we recorded these. Yes, there's something really there. No, they don't come from aliens, or we don't think so. We have no proof of it. But it may be Russia or China in their hypervelocity missiles. Okay,
Mm-mm. No.
sorry, but a missile doesn't fly like that.
No.
And if it's a hypervelocity missile, it doesn't suddenly go into the ocean without tearing itself up. It doesn't, rotate around while it's moving forward. So it bothers me that they're creating this specter of it's another evil country against us U.S. Americans.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That's
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 not right.
supposed to be making us feel better.
That's sad, and don't be hooked in by it.
No.
Do they want us to feel better by saying that it's from a Russian craft rather than a UFO? They think that's better?
I don't think they think it's better. I think they believe that if you can create the specter of another country getting us into a technology race, that's good for more billions to the defense contractors, because then that's something we can go, build against. But if it's technology from extraterrestrials that is way beyond our current technological capability, what technology do we go create?
We panic.
when we sign the check over to the military industrial complex for another 100 billion, what do we put down at the bottom? This is for fighting ET. Well, ET is not being aggressive. They're being teasing, but as I was stating last week, ET has yet to shoot down any of our aircraft or blow up anything of ours. So we should consider them advanced technology, but a threat. If they really wanted to be a threat, they would have already been a threat. So I look at it as hopefully not too many people will get hooked by the must be them foreigners. We got to spend hundreds of billions to defeat the dreaded enemy.
I see. I appreciate that information.
Yeah, I looked at that and said, okay, I need to wait until the official publicly released report from the U.S. military comes out.
Do we know when that'll be?
As I said, later in June, towards the end of the month.
I missed that. Thank you.
Yep. And so that's all the news I had for this week. So this week's presentation is going to be on essentially power plant designs, which sounds boring, but I think you'll find it interesting once we get into it. So tonight's discussion was something that I often look at technology as trends change, and I discovered that Florida Power and Light had this thing called green hydrogen. And so I had to dig deep. I had to find out all about it. So tonight's discussion is going to be on how they're transitioning from other sources of fossil fuel powering their generating plants to solar, and then how solar works in with hydrogen and liquid natural gas or liquefied natural gas. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So as I said, it's not astronomical or phenomenon. It's not on global warming, and it doesn't attest to global warming. So that's, not part of the discussion. But what it does talk about is Florida Power and Light is actually part of a bigger corporation called NextEra, and they do a lot of power technology and power plant management around the world. But our local branch of that is Florida Power and Light. So we're going to talk about photovoltaic or solar cells, power generation, high capacity batteries, using electrolysis to take water and split it into hydrogen and oxygen, and how you can generate power from the combustion of liquid hydrogen. And maybe towards the end, we'll talk about using thermocouples to produce electricity. Well, the photovoltaic cells, thermocouples, and using fuel cells powered by hydrogen and oxygen, those are all related to technologies involving space exploration. So it's not too far removed. If you have certain beliefs about global warming, melting ice, sea level rise, renewable energy sources, or if your preference is some other form of producing electricity, maybe some of the things will not be to your cup of tea, but the intent is not to stir the pot on those issues. So industrial power generation, it's always about the search for optimization. A multi-billion-dollar corporation like NextEra would always like to have power plants produce the power for the least cost to them, the least maintenance, and the least replacement cost for the technology. So they're going to follow a set of business guidelines. Always going to have to produce more power. When we transitioned from filament-based bulbs to LEDs, what did people do? They went out and they put in more bulbs and brighter bulbs. And so, okay, you got to produce more power to compensate for that. And waste output is something that has to be monitored because that's a cost of doing things. So you want to design your plant based upon whatever the fuel costs are. So whatever you're using for fuel, if that cost trends towards another source of fuel and is trending downward, you probably have to redesign your power plant periodically to accommodate it. So FP&L, not in Florida so much as in Georgia, actually had a coal-fired power plant that they had to switch to something else, and they're paring it down and switching it to natural gas. A number of power plants in Florida, they were burning fuel oil. And when there were price spikes on fuel oil and T. Boone Pickens was making natural gas inexpensive, they demolished a number of plants in Florida and very rapidly rebuilt them as natural gas fired plants. But then as photovoltaic came in, they started adding photovoltaic, solar cells, solar panels to their production formula. And, you know, they've still got some nuclear like Turkey Point and a few other places in Florida. So if you have to demolish and rebuild in an expedited manner your power generation plants too often, that's not cost effective. So you want to only do that maybe once every 10 to 20 years so that you amortize the building cost and the demolish of the previous one off your budget. We got some background noise from something. Okay. Okay. So they want to keep nuclear in their back pocket so long as there's subsidies for nuclear fuel production and for nuclear waste disposal. They can operate fission plants cost effectively. But as soon as those subsidies go away, you're going to watch the nuclear plants just disappear in a heartbeat because they would cost them probably hundreds of millions to billions per year just to deal with fuel costs and waste rod disposal costs. Maybe someday fusion will actually exist and be cost effective, but it's nowhere near that for industrial scale production use. So as the saying goes, follow the leader, or in the case of business, watch the big boy. NextEra Energy is a division of NextEra, the parent company of Florida Power and Light. FP&L operates a wide variety of renewable source power generation stations throughout the world. Next year is the world's largest producer of wind and solar energy. They watch trends in industrial power generation and the startup and operational costs. In the state of Florida, next year has spent more than $1 billion to demolish and in an expedited manner rebuild through redesign a number of the power generation stations in Florida. So until fusion comes along, as of 2020, they've aligned on an approach that seems to be so optimal that they can actually hold out until fusion becomes extremely cost effective. It's solar electrolysis to hydrogen with liquefied natural gas as a backstop. They're referring to this as green hydrogen power generation station concept. Most people don't know this, but FP&L has been looking at alternative power sources and actually operating plants outside of Florida for some time. You might have seen pictures of that solar furnace where they have a bunch of mirrors on the ground all pointing up to a tower, and in the tower it gets over 1,000 degrees, and they actually use molten salt as a heat transfer agent to make steam to produce the electricity. Slightly cooler, not high temperature form of that is they have giant arrays of curved mirrors on the ground, and in the center focal point of the curved mirrors are glass tubes that contain oil, and they heat the oil above the boiling point of water, and they can then use the heat in the oil to produce steam to drive turbines. You can actually see on Google Earth enormous solar arrays out in Southern California that are operated by FP&L, not in Florida, but on the deserts of California, east of the major cities. So land's cheap and not many people can see them unless they're airborne. And some of those solar plants, they actually have access to liquefied natural gas as a backup. So during the daytime, they use solar to produce electricity, and at night, they burn natural gas. And a number of places across the US, FP&L manages very large wind power farms in Texas and in the state of Washington, Oregon border. So FP&L has been doing this for some time, looking at how do we optimize our power generation. Now, kind of they don't make much fanfare about it. They do publicly announce it and they put out press releases and such, but how many people were aware that in 2013, FP&L completely demolished the fuel oil burning power plant at Port Everglades in Fort Lauderdale? And in 2016, they opened a new power plant there. So in 2013, they demolished the entire area. And then by 2016, they had a new power plant up and running. They went from 4 fuel oil burning turbines to 3 liquefied natural gas burning turbines.
Excuse
The
me,
old smokestacks used to put out tons of smoke, and the new ones are much cleaner.
The new ones visually are cleaner, but liquefied natural gas, when it's burned, puts out a lot of CO2. You just can't see it.
Right, right. But I mean the particulates.
Oh yeah, years ago when Herb and I would close the observatory as the sun was rising in the east, many was the time that I drove east on what was not the expanded 595, but on 84, and I can see the sun coming up in the east, and the smokestacks at FP&L's fuel oil burning plant were gray at night, but you couldn't see it because it was gray. And as the dawn rose, they would inject water into the exhaust, which would make it turn white, which everybody knows white means it's not dirty. So, they were literally pumping out
Clever.
pollutants at night when you couldn't see it. And as soon as the dawn came up, it's all white again. So
They were doing that over here at Garbage Mountain in the Wheelabrator plant.
yeah,
So at night you would see all the white stuff, smoke would come out. And like they closed that for some apparent reason.
yeah. Well, they found out that when you burn garbage and you don't really, completely clean out all the hazardous waste, you're burning hazardous waste and putting not just CO2, but metallic toxins in the air. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, had to stop that.
Now,
Oh, well, that'd be great.
you had this on at 2013 that they demolished it?
Yeah.
And I gather, I don't know, but I took it as it being negative when you were first doing this, that it was like they were demolishing this whole thing and then they went and built it up in 2016. But it isn't something that was negative. As other people pointed out, this changed what they were doing there to a better system. Am I correct?
To a more cost-effective one. Remember, fuel oil prices went up. Liquefied natural gas prices, courtesy of T. Boone Pickens, were artificially low. And it was worth the $1.2 billion investment to, in a 3-year time period, demolish the existing power generation facility to the ground and build up a completely new one that ran on a different fuel. So yes, it was good that they switched from a more polluting to a less polluting plant design. But they didn't do it for that reason. They did it because the liquefied natural gas was far cheaper than the ever increasing and Middle Eastern governed fuel oil price. So it was predominantly a long-term cost-saving measure. And if you watch the FPL commercials on TV, they will tout our prices are lower than they were years ago. Well, you're consuming more power. So the rate may be lower, but your bill didn't really go down all that much.
No.
But yeah, congrats on converting from a more polluting to a less polluting, but still polluting technology. But they did it for the cost of power generation, money saving.
Which is usually what we see. Now, there isn't anything else that they could do that would make it better than what it is now?
Oh yeah, they could have flipped it to solar.
Oh, okay.
And that's where we're going to get to, is how for the money they're doing this. There are old Star Trek episodes, the original series, that showed these dilithium mining planets. So they just showed this lovely background diagram, and they showed the industrial complex just going off into the distance, major, completely automated production plants. And when I first saw the FP&L power generation station on Southern Boulevard west of West Palm Beach, that was my first thought was, this is enormous. They took land that they bought, scraped it all clean, and put in a liquefied natural gas burning power plant. And not too many years later, they literally doubled the size of the plant. And if you look next to it, there's an enormous lake that they use for cooling the turbines. So they bring in the water, heat it up, and then they discharge it back into their own lake. So it's a closed loop system. And that concept of cooling your own water in your own lake, we'll get to that a little later, involving Turkey Point. So that's the plant off of Southern Boulevard in West Palm Beach. How many people knew of the Dania Beach power plant? So if you go Griffin Road, east of State Road 7, you'll see a power plant. they recently demolished the original power plant, but they still had power from the area because right along 595, they put in 5 liquefied natural gas generating power turbines. So they increased capacity, which is what they have to do as a business. And they didn't want to be without power production in that part of the grid. So they built the 5 new turbines, and that allowed them to demolish the existing plant and build 4 more turbines that were bigger. So that's an artist rendering in the foreground there. But that's right off Griffin Road, between 595 and Griffin Road, north to south, and east of 441. You can kind of see the garbage mound there up at the top left corner of the image. They just, they put out a press release, not a lot of hype about it. And, oh, by the way, we're going to demolish this and build another one. And we're just added to the total cost of what we're doing in Florida to do that, spending over $2 billion. And rather than spending their own money, they went to the Florida Public Service Commission and said, can we get a slight rate hike? So this is the right time to make solar panels or photovoltaics work for FP&L. Liquefied natural gas has kind of peaked out as being a very low cost source, and it has certain efficiency items that I have to deal with. Like I said, it produces CO2 when it burns, but you can't see it. So until somebody actually scratches below the surface and pays attention to it, they're okay with it. They've just spent a lot of money on those plants, and they'd like to, amortize that over the next 10 to 20 years. Photovoltaic cells have right now a lower cost than when they originally came out. They have a useful longevity. They're good for 10, 15, 20 plus years. And they can produce them and install them at industrial scale, because you don't have to build a giant building to put them out there. They're literally mounted on frames on the ground, and you don't even put motors in them to tilt them. You just have them always pointed in optimal direction, and they're great. There is a new kind of solar cell coming out called a Perskovite cell that, rather than only converting the visible light into electricity, it converts a much broader spectra of light into electricity. So it can convert some infrared into electricity, some visible light into electricity, a little bit of UV into electricity. So from an existing square inch of solar panel, you're going to get more power out of it. So this is something that, if all they have to do is replace panels, that's a lot less expensive than demolishing a power generation station and building a new one. So it can
That would
only
be
get
great on cloudy days.
Yeah, it can only get better over time. We'll get to what to do on a cloudy day shortly, but FP&L has a plan, and you can go read this on their website, to put 30 million solar panels in the state of Florida by 2030. And they're already looking at, and the technology is getting better. They're planning on upgrading them, maybe to Perskovite cells, within the next 15 to 20
Oh, we'll pay for one.
So as soon as they can get 50% more output out of it, they'll just do a crash course and stop the old panels and start the new panels and replace as needed. So now the solar panels do not replace the natural gas fired power plants. They're in addition to them. What FP&L is also doing, which you'll see this shortly, they're adding battery storage. So during the daytime, when they're producing more power than is actually being consumed, they charge up the batteries so that at night, when the sun's not out, they can actually power your home off of their battery storage, and they don't have to burn the liquefied natural gas at night, or if it gets a little shady. So it's a buffer. The batteries are a buffer. So for those people that don't think FP&L is spending a lot of money on solar power in Florida. This is the list of all the names of the sites in Florida where there are large photoelectric arrays. And you can go on FPNL site and just look them up and see them near you. You know, many, many acres of solar panels. And they're going to put in 30 million of them by 2030. So that's a lot of them. I don't know how they arrived at that 30 million by 2030. It just seems coincidental. If they made it 2050, would they put in 50 million panels?
And they don't say what the size of them are.
They're pretty much the standard size panels, the kind, you know, the same size as you'd put on your house. They just have a lot more of them.
Did you say there was a drawback by putting solar panels in?
No.
Oh, okay. Is there a drawback?
Other than the land that it consumes, you know, because it does take a lot of acreage, but they're doing this out in the middle of, you know, Everglades or Everglades adjacent land where the when you buy it in large quantities, the per acre cost is really cheap.
Is there some reason they couldn't do it on top of buildings?
No, commercial properties are doing that. There is a lot of hotels that are putting solar panels on top of their, you know, multi-story flat roof hotel buildings to subsidize their power costs. It's not to produce enough power to completely disconnect from the power grid, but if they can get 50% of their power off of solar panels and they don't have to pay for it, you know, pay for the fuel cost, amazing. If you have ever operated a commercial property that needed electricity, you would realize that the kilowatt hour rate for commercial properties that are not buying in bulk is much higher than the residential rate. Commercial properties pay more so that homeowners don't feel like they're paying a lot. So FPNL has deployed battery centers, and the one down at the bottom in the background there is Babcock Ranch over on the west coast of Florida, and it's large. That's a couple of megawatts of power in batteries, but they've got it in a hybrid fashion. So certain places like the Citrus Center has some number of battery compartments, but it's not enormous. And the community 1, 2, and 3, they didn't list which communities, but there's certain things in a community that need power. And when the power fails, they need backup power. So they've installed some amount of battery backup capability in neighborhoods. I guess that's if a municipality's local fire station or kind of city hall annex or something needs some 30 minutes of ride through, they can drop one of these battery centers nearby. So I don't know how many people have heard of the term curtailing, but if you have solar arrays that produce more power than actively can be used at any point in time, you're literally, without batteries, dumping the power on the floor. Hey, that's you know, that's green. That's money that we can't sell. You know, that's power that has been produced courtesy of sunlight that we can't make any money off of because nobody wants those kilowatt hours right now. So they put in batteries to avoid curtailing, which is also referred to as clipping or dumping. You've generated the power, but you can't make money off of it right now. So if you haven't got some way of storing it, then you're just dumping the money. But when you have 30 million solar panels by 2030, that's a lot of power generation. And if you don't need it on a dynamic basis, you have excess, how do you store it? There have been a number of ways to do this. Batteries, but you know, once you get a couple of megawatts worth of batteries, it starts to get expensive to have all those batteries. If we were a mountainous terrain, you could have elevated water hydro, pump water up into a dam so that during the evening hours, you can use the water running through a turbine to generate electricity. They've even done studies in other countries where you use electricity to run motors to raise tons of concrete. And then when you need the power later, you reverse it so that instead of taking power running the motor, you make the motor be a generator and produce electricity by slowly descending these tonnage of concrete blocks. And that kind of has an upper limit on it. How much tonnage are you going to have hanging in the air? So they need an ultra-dense means of storing the already generated power and immediately converting it back into sellable power at some point in the future without a high cost of storage and in a manner that stores for longevity. So how would you do this? Well, what they came up with is if you take the solar power and you use that to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, you can store liquefied hydrogen and burn it later. So that's what they're going to be doing. And what they did was they modified some turbines that are currently burning liquefied natural gas to switch and be able to burn liquid hydrogen. So they can take the power plant to the next stage of cleaner, while at the same time, they have solar that produces more than they need because they're putting in a lot more panels. They then use electrolysis, which is powered by electricity, to take the water they already have, convert it into liquid hydrogen, which they store locally on site. And then when they need it, they've got a buffered form of stored energy. So electrolysis consumes a lot of electricity to split the water. It's not the most efficient way of doing it, but they've got the electricity. It's solar powered. They're not paying fuel oil or anything like that for it. But to store hydrogen in its high pressure liquid state, you need 10,000 pounds per square inch storage tanks, and you need to critically cool it to minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit. So why not do it? It doesn't cost them anything extra because they're getting their power from solar. So that's what they're going to be doing.
Well, but aren't they going to have to use a lot of that power to keep it cool?
Yes, but given that they're putting in 30 million solar panels, they have a lot of excess production capacity. And they have these giant reservoirs near the power plants that are used for cooling the liquefied natural gas turbines. So they're already using the water that's there, taking the water, filtering it so that they can run it through electrolysis and produce hydrogen at no fuel cost for the power. It's just a nice closed loop system. But why hydrogen? Turns out if you burn hydrogen, let's say we have a balance of hydrogen versus gasoline. 1 kilogram of hydrogen produces the same amount of energy as 2.8 kilograms of gasoline. The issue, though, between the two is hydrogen burns far faster than gasoline. So you can combust the hydrogen to make heat, to make steam, to run the power generation, to produce the electricity. Combusting hydrogen produces no carbon pollutants. The exhaust products are heat and water vapor. And they already have the cooling systems for the heat. So they can modify the existing natural gas fueled turbines to alternately switch and burn liquid hydrogen, which is clean. They've already got the water. The water reservoirs are filled by rainwater. So it's not like the water is costing them anything. If they really get stuck, they can use desalinated ocean water. And how would they desalinate it? Using the excess electricity they have. So it's, once again, a closed loop system that doesn't have any fuel cost. So they can then take what would be curtailed solar excess, store it in batteries, and then later on use the stored power for production of hydrogen. They could, they store the hydrogen in tanks at the power station because it burns so quickly. You don't want to have to create a hydrogen plumbing system to get the hydrogen across the state of Florida. So what can they ship cheapest across the state of Florida? Electricity. They already have a grid for doing that.
Yeah.
So if there's not enough sun for solar and you really get stuck, then you can run, the power plants on natural gas. But if you've already produced the hydrogen and there's not enough solar, you run the power plants on hydrogen. So you're avoiding the curtailing. You take the excess solar, you produce hydrogen, and you generate power burning hydrogen. So cheap.
Well,
But it does.
you keep saying that there might be an excess of electricity that they don't know what to do with.
Yes.
Can't they just put it on the national grid and sell it off to other people who might need it?
The myth of the national grid. The state of Texas literally is disconnected from other states because they didn't want to deal with the cost exchange for sharing their power. And if they ever needed power, they didn't want to pay other states for their power. So this is why when they had problems with their power plants due to excess water coming from the sky, they lost power in Texas across a lot of the state. But yes, a grid would be nice, and then you could share it. The state of California does this with nearby states, and there are times when the cost of power just gets really expensive in California because for whatever reason they can't generate enough in the state, so they have to buy from other states. But when they're selling it to other states, it's a bumper crop. So a general grid where you can share the power has its pluses and minuses. But if you're the guy that always has power and can always produce an excess and sell it to other states, you're the one in the catbird seat, so to speak. So here's an end-to-end diagram. Some people they can connect the dots if they see a diagram. So on the left side, we have solar arrays to produce immediate electricity. And if it's not consumed, it would be curtailed and just thrown on the floor. So you put in buffering, you put in batteries, and then you deliver the power solar arrays through the battery system to the grid, and it goes out to consuming customers. But if you have an excess, you can run that excess across your grid over to your other power generation stations where you have a giant water reservoir, and through electrolysis, you produce liquid hydrogen that you can store on site. And you make the power generation station so that it can flip of the switch, so to speak, burn natural gas or burn hydrogen. And they're doing that across multiple power plants in Florida. So you can see it's a closed loop system here. And the cost for running, the fuel cost is sunlight. That's the maximum endpoint. If it goes the other direction, they're back on liquefied natural gas. But they'd like to push it out so that solar excess becomes hydrogen, which they can burn as a buffer anytime they need it. So here it is being put into practice. Over on the west coast of Florida, south of Tampa, east of Bradenton, in Manatee County, there is the Manatee Energy Storage Center, a large solar power generation array, and they've added $65 million worth of batteries to it. The battery storage capacity in late 2021 will be 409 megawatts in batteries. Okay?
Wow, that's a big battery.
If that fills up, they have a way of diverting 20 megawatts of it across the Florida grid to Indiantown, Florida, on the East Coast, sort of west of Jupiter. At that site, they're going to produce hydrogen, store it in tanks on site, and then use it for production, for combustion production at the Okeechobee power plant in Indiantown, Florida, north of West Palm. So it's cheap to route 2 megawatts of power across FP&L's grid. They already have the grid. There's no, natural gas pipeline that has to be built. The turbines at the Okeechobee plant are 1.75 gigawatts, or gigawatts if some people like that. And they've been modified to burn either natural gas or hydrogen. So this is the FP&L green hydrogen solution, and it expects to start servicing customers in 2023. So in 2020, they came up with this idea, and 3 years later, they don't have to demolish the plant. All they have to do is just change the burners in it to burn selectively either natural gas or hydrogen.
Is this hackable? Can this
Given
be?
that it's FP&L, I would say no.
Oh,
If it was some sort of fly-by-night Power R Us company, I'd say, yeah, you need to make sure it's protected. But given that FP&L is part of Next Era Energy, which is considered critical infrastructure for the United States, I think there's a U.S. federal office called the CISA, the Critical Infrastructure, I forget what the S stands for, Service Agency, Critical Infrastructure Service. They're the ones that monitor, the power grid, natural gas, oil refineries, the big stuff. They're the ones
well,
that.
this is Florida. That's why I asked,
This is at a federal level that CISA exists.
Okay, good.
So
Thank you.
I don't think it, I could be wrong, but given the scale of what they're doing and how much they're spending, I think that they're considering things like, is it something that's considered a critical infrastructure? Yes. Is it something that they're going to defend the technology? I think. Then, they could outsource something and do something stupid. And yeah. So,
Thank you.
So this is the Cross Florida Green Energy Generation concept. Solar panels and batteries over in Manatee on the West Coast, and they deliver 20 megawatts over to the East Coast to produce the hydrogen stored on site, and then you can selectively burn hydrogen or liquefied natural gas as a backstop should you run out of hydrogen. So the downsides of electrolysis and storing liquid hydrogen. Water separated into hydrogen and oxygen by electrolysis is the water that's already in their cooling reservoir, so the water doesn't cost them anything, and it gets refilled by rain in Florida unless there's a drought. Electrolysis is not extremely optimal. I'm sure the technology can improve over time, but they've got an abundance of solar power, so the fuel cost for running the electrolysis is, once you have the solar panels in place and the grid operating, is zero. You have to store the liquefied hydrogen under extreme pressure, which means you need fancy tanks. It's not your normal, propane gas tank for your backyard barbecue. If hydrogen gets ignited, it instantly combusts with all available fuel sources, and there's oxygen in the atmosphere, so it burns up rather explosively, but it burns up very quickly. So if there is a leak in it, it goes up. There's not going to be a lot of burning things afterwards because it'll combust it. But they do have additional plumbing for routing the liquefied hydrogen, and they do have to take storage precautions, for lightning protection and things like that. But they know how to do that kind of stuff because they do it at launch complexes in Florida. So there's people that know how to do that already. These tanks are not 100% insulated. Temperature changes, sort of going from clouds to sun to clouds, make just enough temperature change in the tank that you have to have the tank vent. And the venting is called vaporization. That's where the liquefied hydrogen gets bled off and you see a jet, a cloudy exhaust coming out of the tank. And that's because, the sun is now shining on the tank and it got 1/10 of a degree warmer. And when you're talking about the temperature of liquefied hydrogen, that small temperature change is enough to cause a lot of pressure differential in the tank that has to be bled out through vaporization. But if you went to all the trouble to take water and make your hydrogen fuel, vaporization is like money, just throwing money away. But vaporization is also an accidental ignition hazard. So you need to make sure how you deal with it. They may bubble it through water. They may deliberately recombine it without a spark with oxygen just to make it water vapor instead of hydrogen. But like I said, there's rocket launching sites in Florida that know how to deal with this stuff, and I'm guessing they're talking to their contractors. But here's the other thing. FP&L could find its way into being a rocket fuel generation company. So if instead of throwing away the oxygen when you generate your hydrogen from the water, if you store the hydrogen and store the oxygen both at liquefied states, maybe you can sell that as rocket fuel. Given the growth of rocket industries and commercial providers, you could go into business selling rocket fuel. So, and just up the coast from where this power plant is the U.S. Space Force. Maybe they can get a government contract. So effectively, what they've done is created a closed loop system here. The panels produce excess power. They'll store it in batteries until they need it. They'll route it over the grid to produce liquid hydrogen. They'll produce the hydrogen from their existing water reservoir. They can store it on site in tanks. The hydrogen is less expensive than would be liquefied natural gas. So when they have the hydrogen, spend less money to produce fuel. When they don't, then they have to use the liquefied natural gas. You've got to ask yourself, though, if they're producing the power from hydrogen, are they going to have a discount on your power bill because the fuel costs drop considerably below natural gas? Or are they going to say, we didn't have enough hydrogen now, there's going to be a fuel surcharge for when they had to run on natural gas? One can guess which way they're going to go with this. So the hydrogen fueled turbine exhaust is non-polluting. It's water vapor and lots of heat. Over time, they can expand the number of solar panels. They can replace them with more efficient ones. They can add more batteries. They can replace the original batteries with more efficient batteries. These are all incremental upgrades. They can find cheaper production mechanisms for electrolysis or for storing it better. These are all incremental, where you don't have to demolish your power plant in order to make more green energy. So non-polluting, zero cost fuels. How much more optimal can next era FP&L get it? The one remaining downside they have burning hydrogen is heat. So burning hydrogen produces water vapor and heat. There's no carbon pollutants. It's very efficient, produces an abundance of heat. Like I said, it burns hotter than gasoline. So you take the heat, convert it to steam with water to drive turbines to produce electricity. But they have far more heat than they can actively utilize to heat up the water to run the power plant. So they would have to dial it back because you're going to get more heat from the hydrogen than you're going to get out of the natural gas. So how do they dispose of the heat currently? They pass it into water. Oh, okay. Passing into the water is going to make your water reservoir hotter, which warms up the air, atmospheric heating. What they could do is do what NASA does with deep space probes. Take thermocouples, take the excess heat, and produce more electricity, which would be interesting because now they can take what would be a waste product, their excess heat, and use it to produce even more electricity. So you can think of it as the excess heat, having to deal with it is another form of curtailing. But finding a way to take the excess heat and produce even more electricity from it, it's another win. So we'll see what they do with the excess heat from the hydrogen combustion. As far as mitigating excess water heat has been an issue at FP&L plants like Turkey Point for decades. And there's a picture of it. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the picture, a little bit bigger than the yellow push pin that's there is the actual size of the power plant. All that little green chicane stuff you see down there, that's the cooling canals. That actually takes the heated water coming out of the turbines and runs it down zigzag pathways to dissipate the heat into the air. But the water in South Florida can't get cooled fast enough, so the water stays warm, and green algae just loves that warm water, which is why the canals are all bright green. So, you know, you're not going to build a canal system like this around all of the hydrogen burning power plants. You're going to have to find a way to deal with the excess heat, and they need to look at thermocouples. So, conclusions. Big corporations always look for a way to spend some money to redesign things and you know, make more. So this current solar to battery to electrolysis to hydrogen, that's just the latest transition. Nuclear, that says fusion, you should say fission, is coming under increasing scrutiny because of what happened in Japan with Fukushima. And if they ever lose the federal subsidy for fuel and disposal, they could shut those plants down pretty quickly. They haven't built a lot of new ones recently because of all of the environmental licensing you have to have. So before fusion comes online, which is always decades away in the future for big power companies, they can use this hydrogen approach very effectively. So the way they're going for now is their green hydrogen approach, which is this end-to-end closed loop system. So maybe someday fuel cells will improve to the point where they can be deployed for large scale production of electricity, and they can get rid of the turbines and the natural gas fired power plants, but that's a ways away. Any questions, comments?
I have always been under the impression that, except for Texas, the whole country is connected by this big grid. Am I wrong on that?
Not everywhere is connected. When you get into smaller cities that have their own local power generation, they aren't connected on the grid.
Oh.
But California and its neighboring states are definitely connected on the grid, and they've had pluses and minuses as to how cost effective it is, depending upon whether you're the abundant power producer or the not producing enough power needer. And like I said, Texas has isolated itself from the US grid.
Adam has a question on the chat.
Adam has a question on the chat. Okay. I will apologize here that I haven't been minding the chat. I've only got one set of eyes that I was staring at the program, and this is the screen. Okay, let's see here. Yes, the official report on the UFOs has been delayed. Like I said, later this month was their original estimate. And yeah, there are heavy metals, dioxins, and methane they have to deal with as pollutants. But they didn't mention thermal pollution because that's another elephant in the room. But if you look in the history of Turkey Point, it's been an issue for some time. Yes, Texas didn't want to follow the safety regulations because they would have to be held accountable, and that's the last thing they want to do. Huh. Yes, oil companies financing politicians is something that could stop this, but I've got to believe that Next Era Energy is looking out for their own wallet, and they're not waiting on politicians to decide to make things more energy efficient. They're just going, okay, we're going to spend a couple of $1 billion. We're going to demolish some power plants and build some new ones. And then when solar started to come on strong, we don't have to build the power plants again. So how can we, make this hybrid where we'll get solar when we can, and when we can't, we'll burn liquefied natural gas. And that was how they were doing it. It's called a hybrid. But they took that one step further and said, we don't have to buy a lot of batteries. We don't mind buying some batteries, but we're now
Hello?
more power than we need.
Hello?
So yes, Adam.
Oh, I was testing my microphone. I didn't think it worked. Yeah, so it's working now. Oh, good.
Okay.
So I saw that a couple of guys, Bill somebody and Warren somebody, are building some kind of new fishing plant in Wyoming.
Yeah, I wish them a lot of luck, but I don't think it's going to be industrial scale soon, and it's not going to be cost effective. But solar is very cost effective right now.
In Florida, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a question about that Wheelabrator plant.
Yes.
You said I live a block away from it, and I even remember when it caught fire in the middle of the hurricane.
Yeah.
How long do I have to live?
I don't know.
It's Heinziger that
Zinga. Yeah.
he sold it.
Yeah.
You're
Well,
saying
he knew when it was time to. He knew when it was time to get out.
Uh-huh. Yep, he did the same thing with the Sunrise Music Hall.
Yeah, he's a man who's made a lot of money off the businesses that he's run.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy.
But he started out in the garbage business, so.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Does he still have that?
I think he's got a piece of that action. I don't think he owns it completely anymore.
Waste management. He had enough sports teams for a while there.
Yeah.
Those
Those are fun when you can control them. And if you look
Yeah.
at what he did, he spent money to get the best players, got himself a championship, and then gutted the team, sold off all the players, made money off of it, and then
Marlins, yeah.
the following season he spent the money again, got the best players again, got himself another trophy to sit on his bookshelf, and then gutted the team again.
Yeah.
So he literally wanted to prove that all of these team owners, if they want to win a championship, they just need to spend money.
Yeah.
So, but that's what wealthy people do, is they point out that
Eh,
their wealth allows them to do things that other people would find impossible.
uh-huh. True that.
Okay, any other comments? So while this video is still in the pipeline for editing and posting, I came across industrial power generation using liquefied air, essentially liquefied nitrogen or LN2 from the ambient air. instead of using liquefied hydrogen, LH2, which would be split from water by electrolysis. And I also came across thermoelectric power, something called CBEC or TEG power generation, which doesn't require any moving parts or turbines or generators. So I added a few slides and an additional video. Enjoy. So power generation by expanding air versus burning liquid hydrogen. Being the polymath that I am, I always like to dig into the details of anything that crosses my path, particularly when there's increased information or alternatives on our current research topic, particularly since I haven't yet done the video posting on it. So lined up well, good nexus of knowledge and opportunity, so why not? So as I pointed out early in the presentation, large corporations that produce electrical power for profit are always going to be looking into more contemporary ways of doing so at greater efficiencies with reduced fuel costs, even if it costs hundreds of millions to billions of dollars to migrate existing power generation stations. So that's where liquid air, essentially liquefied nitrogen or LN2 taken from the air, come into the picture. And two companies, one called Highview Power and another one called Cryomatics. And I've got some videos here. The first video is on power generation from liquid air, and it's done by an independent video source on YouTube. And then I have another video from High Power themselves about their product offering. And then another video from Cryomatics Corporation, which is the company that makes the turbines for taking liquid air and driving generators. So why liquid air? Liquid air, which is essentially liquid nitrogen, is storable at a much higher temperature than liquid hydrogen. Liquid nitrogen can be stored at negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas liquid hydrogen is negative 423 degrees Fahrenheit, so much colder for liquid hydrogen. Liquid nitrogen can be stored at a lower pressure, meaning instead of thick-walled tanks to hold the pressure, they can use thinner, more readily available, cheaper steel wall tanks. Liquid nitrogen can be stored at 537 pounds per square inch, whereas liquid hydrogen requires upwards of 10,000 pounds per square inch. So much more complicated and expensive tanks for liquid hydrogen than for liquid nitrogen. And also a lower pressure means less vaporization curtailment. That's the process whereby if a liquid hydrogen tank has it go from being covered in clouds to being heated by sunlight, that few degrees difference in the tank external temperature is going to be a change in the liquid hydrogen stored in it, which means you have to vent the excess, and venting something that you went to the trouble to store to make money on is lost revenue. Also, liquid nitrogen is a larger molecule than liquid hydrogen, so it's less likely to escape through plumbing joints. And once again, escaping product that you spent money to create, even though there's no fuel cost, is lost revenue. So here's a picture from Highview Power on their generation process. So in the lower left, you see air comes in, air which is predominantly nitrogen, but it also has oxygen, otherwise what we'll be breathing, plus some rare gases, the argons, neons, and things like that that you really want to scrub out of there. So it goes through a cleaning or filtering process. They then compress it, kind of like an air conditioner compressor kind of thing, that will refrigerate the air or the nitrogen by then. It takes electricity to do that, so there's power coming in. The end result is they have refrigeration, which makes the critically cooled liquid nitrogen. They store that in tanks. When they need it to generate power, they literally warm it up or let the air warm it up, and the warmth causes rapid expansion of the liquid nitrogen into gaseous nitrogen. And when it does that, that extra pressure is used to drive the turbines, which drives the generators. Now, there's no combustion. Liquid nitrogen isn't being combusted here. They're just literally allowing it to expand, which is a high pressure, to blow the turbine to make it spin to produce power. And the gaseous nitrogen that is exhaust from the expansion is just sent out into the air, where it joins up and becomes more nitrogen in the air. The end result is power comes out. Now, when the expansion occurs, it does produce some heat, not as much as burning liquid hydrogen, but it produces heat. So they send that extra heat back to the compression cycle, because if you remember refrigeration, you have to heat and expand, and so they use that heat to lighten the electrical load on the compression process. This is a chromatics diagram of their turbine and how they use the air along with the expanding liquid nitrogen, the liquid air, to drive a shaft which drives the electrical turbine. Kind of looks like a jet engine, but they use a heat transfer fluid to kind of keep the stability up and keep the turbine moving. And they use air blowing around, the air bypass, to also stabilize the turbine RPMs. And then they inject the liquid nitrogen into it, and it expands and produces air pressure, which they use to drive the turbine. So why wouldn't Florida Power and Light go with the liquid nitrogen expanding air as opposed to using liquid helium? Well, the answer is simple. They had just spent a lot of money demolishing and rebuilding power stations to switch from fuel oil to liquefied natural gas, and it was much easier to just modify the burners to burn liquid hydrogen or liquid natural gas selectively than it would be to make them be propelled by the expanding gas pressure of liquid nitrogen. So, why demolish the plant and build it again? Because you just did that recently. If you can adapt the process to burn a different fuel, it's much more cost effective. So once FP&L gets more deeply experienced into this solar producing, stored gas, then consumed as a renewable fuel, the next time they have to demolish and rebuild plants, they may consider liquefied air. Or if they have to build any new plants, they may consider liquefied air over liquid hydrogen, because there's a number of factors. The biggest one is cost of storage, which is, if you lose anything through the storage process, that's lost fuel for your generator. But FP&L has always been looking into all sorts of power generation technologies, wind, solar photovoltaic or solar cells, and solar furnaces. So if they have to build any new large scale plants, or if they want to build things from the ground up again, they could take a look at liquid air. Whatever you think of as far as business and efficiencies goes, reality always wins. So if shortly after you've rebuilt your plants, liquid air comes in out of nowhere, you got to take a look at it. So along the lines of making things even more efficient, why not go the next step and do away with the turbines and the generators and the moving parts and generate electricity using solid state technology? There's a physics principle known as the Seebeck effect, where a temperature differential between dissimilar metals, normally thought of as thermocouples, or specific chemistries in solid state chips, can actually induce a flow of electrons. essentially produce electricity from the heat differential. This is also referred to as the thermoelectric generation of electrical power, or TEG. And small versions of these devices are commercially available right now at relatively low cost. And they are also used by NASA for deep space, larger power production for spacecraft. So if you think of the currently active NASA missions of Curiosity, Perseverance, Voyager 1 and 2, and New Horizons, they all use plutonium to generate about 400 degrees Fahrenheit worth of heat to heat up thermocouples against the much lower temperature of the vacuum of space, and that generates electricity. No moving parts, no turbines, no generators. It's just the heat differential producing a flow of electrons, which is electricity. Historically, additional missions have also used radioisotope thermoelectric generators, or RTGs. Cassini around Saturn, Galileo at Jupiter, the earlier on the Ulysses spacecraft, Vikings 1 and 2, Deep Space 1, and Pioneer 10 and 11. They all used thermoelectric power generation. So on a small scale, you might have encountered this technology. You might have seen these camping cook stove heater generators that convert waste heat from your campfire into a few watts of electricity to charge up your mobile phone. It doesn't make use of a specific heat. It actually makes use of the heat differential. So, you know, the cook stove is hot, the air is cooler, so that's how it generates the electricity, is by the differential between the camp stove heat and the air. So it's not the specific high temperature, it's the differential temperature that generates the electricity. So if you take that in the other direction and say, what if we had a very low temperature compared to the ambient? So that's a high differential. And we used TEG thermocouples or solid state arrays, and you cool down one side to a sizable differential to generate electricity. That would produce electricity without turbines, without water cooling, and without spinning generators. The equipment cost is less, the maintenance cost is less. It's scalable, its efficiency upgradable as you know, more efficient solid state TEG devices come into play. And as you exhaust the liquid nitrogen from liquid to gas across the TEG, the exhaust, the still quite cold gaseous nitrogen, could be used to expedite the liquid nitrogen chilling, or it could be used for, you know, cooling water to generate air conditioning. So here's a couple of links. The first is just on the CBEC thermoelectric generator concept. The next one is from a vendor who resells TEG solid state devices. And the last one is actually a doctoral thesis that somebody produced on how you would use cryogenic temperatures for TEG, for thermoelectric generation, instead of just heat. So that's the end of the update. Then you'll see the about that it, you know, describes me as the presenter, but enjoy. Bye.